You're mine. The book of Exodus is, the very title means going out. I was asked tonight by a very brilliant woman, vivacious, attractive, a knockout. What's your name? Karen Kyle? You're married to me? You're mine. You're mine. She asked me if we were going into Exodus, which is kind of a funny way to put it. I thought so anyway, but it's the kind of humor that keeps our household going. We're going into going out. The theme of Exodus is restoration or deliverance. And really, Exodus is a continuation of the account that God gives in the book of Genesis. And God has taken the children of Israel, this family, the descendants of Jacob, renamed Israel, into Egypt. And it is there that in the womb of this nation called Egypt that He is changing them into what He has intended all along for them to be and to become, and that is to move from being a family to becoming a nation, which He had promised would happen. And so by the time we come here to Exodus, they have been in Egypt about 300 years. And God is now getting them ready to bring them out of Egypt. And He begins in verse 1 by saying, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." And so God, true to His word and faithful in His working in this family, they become a nation. And we're going to see as they come out of the nation of Egypt that they're going to have gone from being a family of 70 people to probably a nation of between 2 and 3 million men, women, and children. And so they're multiplying, and then they're growing exceedingly mighty, and there's just this explosion that's going on among God's people, even in this very, very, what was becoming an increasingly difficult situation. And this provokes a response on the part of the world. And we see the response here in verse 8. "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Not only did he not know Joseph, he probably didn't even know of Joseph. Here it's Joseph so faithful in being used by God to preserve even Egypt through this time of tremendous drought that they had been in, the 70 years of famine that had come upon the land. But a few generations go by and they don't even remember who their former deliverers were or who the God was that worked through that person. And we live in this "what have you done for me now lately" world, and because of that we get forgotten pretty quickly. And God's people get forgotten pretty quickly. God's leaders get forgotten pretty quickly. And so they don't even think of Joseph anymore. "And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we.'" And that's always a threat to the world. The world is threatened here. Egypt is threatened by the fact that God's people are multiplying. And the world is always threatened when God's people multiply, whether it's physically in this sense or it's spiritually in the sense of the age in which we live. When more and more people become God's people and give their life unto Him, it's a threat to them. And it's always going to provoke persecution on the parts of those who hold the reins of power and the world that we live in today. And it's important for us to realize as Christians, when the persecution comes against us, as it comes from Egypt against these people, that it's not a bad sign. It's a good sign that these people are flipped out by what it is that God is doing there. And so they're fearful. And an awful lot of persecution comes against us. Got him. Because they are fearful of us. And well, I won't get into it. And so he says, look, they're getting more, they're getting mightier. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. And so he says these guys could turn on us in a battle, and we'd be in a lot of trouble. Now, it's a dangerous thing when a government makes its chief concern the preservation of its own power rather than existing to serve its constituency or its people. Because ultimately it leads to bad decisions, and ultimately it leads to the oppression of the common person by the powers that be. And these godly people would have made wonderful neighbors. There was no reason to attempt to wipe them out or to kill them. There's no reason for the world to try and wipe out and destroy Christians. They make wonderful neighbors. They make wonderful citizens. They can get as goony as the rest of the people at times, but they're largely harmless. They're the salt of the earth, actually, and the light of the world. And so but here there are all, because of their power struggle and what they're wanting to do in their agenda, they see God's people as in the way. And so they're going to go against God's people, but they don't understand that God's people are not just people, but they're God's people. And there's a God that is in relationship with these people, and thus to go against them is to enter into alignment against their God. Now, in the secular realm, in the realm that doesn't take God into account, they have no consideration as it relates to God or any of that. That's nonsense to them. But it doesn't make God any less of a reality as it relates to our lives, and it doesn't make their attempts to destroy the people of God any less futile. And so they're going to try and deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it happened in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us and go up out of the land. We don't want to lose this slave labor that we have. And therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. And so the more persecution that went against God's people, it just created more of God's people. And so the Bible teaches that we're to be very, very concerned when all men speak well of us. I don't regret the day that we live in today in terms of the hostility that is against Christians and all of the misrepresentation and the fighting that comes out against us and all of the pseudo-intellectual language to hide what the hearts and the attitudes of people are towards God's people. I look at it and I say, all right, everything's out in the light. Now we know what we're working with. Now we know, what's going on. Everything's out in the open here. And so it's an interesting time. It's a dark time. It's a difficult time, these days that we live in. But at least things are a little more honest and open than they have been in the past on the part of the enemies as it relates to God's people. Persecution is very, very healthy for the church, and it's very, very healthy for individuals. And so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And it means literally to break them in pieces. They started to work them very, very hard as a slave force. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service with which they made them serve was with rigor. And then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was this and the name of the other was that. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, doesn't that sound comfortable? If it is a son, then you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, then he shall live. And this has been a frequent solution on the part of evil men all through man's history as it relates to dealing with the Jews. Let's kill them, let's wipe them out. And this is the attempt on Pharaoh's part. Wipe out the men. They're the ones that can fight against us. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. We ought to always obey God rather than men. And so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said, Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. It just happens fast there. And therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that He provided households for them. How did God bless the midwives for their faithfulness to Him? By giving them children. He actually considers them a blessing. And they are, and we have to be very, very careful in our thinking, and for the trials that we go sometimes through with our children and the phases that we go through. And sometimes, we can listen to one person's nightmare as it relates to a situation with their child, and we don't see what's completely happened there, and we don't see the final end of what's going to happen there. And all kinds of fear can grip our hearts forever and always as it relates to our kids, and we can end up raising them up into adulthood and the whole time just afraid of what they're going to ultimately do and miss 18 years of enjoying them and the gift that they are. There are trials and there are difficulties. The Lord takes them through them, but let's be careful as it relates to our attitude towards children today, just because they've become disposable in the world. That's not God's attitude toward them. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that He provided households for them, and so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river the Nile, and every daughter you shall save alive. And you look at this whole situation of chapter 1, and life's been going halfway decent for them there in Egypt. And all of a sudden, the furnace gets turned up. All of a sudden, things begin to get very difficult for the children of Israel. And there's a reason for it. Because God has got to place within their heart a dissatisfaction concerning their condition and concerning their place in Egypt, so that they will be ready for the deliverer that He is going to send to deliver them from Egypt. And if it weren't for Him making things a little hot, a little uncomfortable, Moses would come on the scene and say, let's get out of here. And everybody'd go, are you kidding me? My CDs are just about to mature. I'm not getting out of here. And so here He is. He's preparing them for the deliverer. He's preparing them for being motivated to get out of there when He calls them to get out of there. And oftentimes He does that in our lives too. Things begin to get uncomfortable. Well, we thought we had covered everything as it relates to our retirement, or as it relates to our security, as it relates to this thing. And all of a sudden, everything's being messed up, and they're throwing everything into the Nile on me, and they're making it harder and harder and crushing and crushing. And what's going on here, Lord? What's happening? And very, very often, it's a very good thing that's happening. He wants me extra sensitive to Him for what it is that He's doing and what it is that He's going to do, so that I won't miss it when He does it. So He's preparing them for a deliverance.